Hello and welcome to another episode of the Differently Branded podcast. My name is Tommy Trout, your host, and today we're going to be discussing language and messaging in the disability sector. Now, whilst a lot of what I'm about to go through sort of comes a bit more from the NDIS sector here in Australia, I am of the belief that this really does quite apply to a lot of disability sector or adjacent industries anywhere, really. So I'll start by really, asking anyone, open 5 disability service provider websites now, any 5, pick them at random, Google them, and then count how many use the phrase person-centered. Count how many promise to help people achieve goals, achieve independence. How many describe themselves as passionate or dedicated? I already know the answer. I've done the counting. I trawled through the websites of 37 disability sector organisations ahead of a recent industry conference talk I was giving, and I catalogued every piece of sector language that I could find across those 37 organisations. And what I found is not, the occasional phrase used by a few of them. It really was every single provider saying the exact same thing, like quite literally almost like word for word. So I want to go through where the script came from, why it hasn't changed in decades, and what it costs you as an organization, what the problem is, what the issue is. So, across the 37 providers, some of the highlights were here in Australia, 37 out of 37 referred to their customers as NDIS participants. 34 out of 37 promised some form of independence to people with significant disability. 34 out of 37 offered personalised or individualised support, because what else would you do? 33 out of 37 offered person-centred support. Again, don't know what the opposite of that is. 31 out of 37 said that they would help you achieve your goals. 30 out of 37 talked about community participation or engaging in the community or meaningful engagement in their community. And 35 out of 37 referred to themselves as registered NDIS providers, which makes sense. It's a factual compliance statement. However, what I noticed is that it was actually almost always presented as a selling point rather than a requirement. It's sitting in the headlines. It's a hero section piece of messaging. We're an NDIS provider. Aren't we amazing? Beyond the headline terms, we found dozens of phrases just repeating across the sector. Holistic approach, quality care, or quality of life, which is something you talk about when you're considering putting your dog down. Compassionate support, tailored services, choice and control, dignity and respect, empowering. I don't know, I've never had a customer come to me at an NDIS business and ask for empowerment. As a note, there's no empowerment services and there's no empowerment line items in the NDIS. Capacity building, strength-based, evidence-based, whole person approach. Again, none of these words are wrong, and independence matters, but choice and control matter enormously, considering that that's what the NDIS is built upon, and the notion that people should direct their own care and support. The problem really isn't the values behind the language. The problem is that the language has just been used so many times by so many people in so many similar contexts that it just doesn't mean anything anymore. It no longer communicates or articulates anything at all. And what's shocking to a lot of people is that this script, the language hasn't appeared by accident, and it is older than you might realize. The Disability Services Act here in Australia was passed by Parliament in 1986, and it came into effect the following year. Great piece of legislation. It was really significant at the time, and it marked a formal move away from institutional care and the institutional model of disability that had dominated for decades, replacing it with principles around individual needs, maximum participation in community life, integration, and quality of life. It is in living memory that these were actual issues that people with disability had to face, trying to get out of or stay out of institutional care, which were grim to say the least. And then if you read through the language of the Act, you recognise the phrasing: independence, integration, quality of life, maximum participation. Sound familiar? These weren't marketing phrases though in the legislation. They were commitments written to force a generational shift in how disability services were delivered and described. The normalisation movement that influenced this legislation had been building since the 70s. both in Australia and internationally. It was part of the civil rights movement in many ways, and it pushed back against institutional and segregated models of care. By the 80s, the language of that movement had made its way into government policy, which is great, and from government policy into funding agreements and reporting requirements that charities and service providers had to meet to keep their grants. This is where it starts to really matter. The language didn't spread because providers loved it. It spread because they had to use it, as it was often a condition of funding. So the script arrived as a necessary thing that you needed to have and demonstrate and prove over and over again if you were being assessed for funding. If your organization's documentation echoed the language you used in the Act and state-based disability service legislation, your grant applications were obviously more likely to be assessed and approved. But over time, this vocabulary written originally for legislation and grant compliance became the vocabulary providers used to describe themselves to the public, including on marketing materials that had nothing to do with funding compliance at all. In 2013, here in Australia, the National Disability Insurance Scheme began rolling out across the country and fundamentally restructured how disability support was funded and delivered. The shift was enormous, pioneering. Instead of block funding allocated to organisations, funding moved to individualised packages controlled by the participant. In essence, block funding is the government providing X amount of money to this provider in this area to provide these services to these people in these conditions. And often, and I myself worked in this sector back when it was block funded, if you were a block out or had a different type of condition or a co-condition, you wouldn't be eligible and you were out of luck. So, it's good that we moved away from that. And the model went from that provider-directed charity to consumer-directed marketplace. This was supposed to be a paradigm shift, echoing the significance of the 1986 Act. Providers are no longer competing for the government grants behind closed doors. They were competing for customers who could choose to take their funding elsewhere if they were unhappy. In a genuine consumer market, you would expect brand differentiation to become critical. You would expect organizations to sharpen their positioning, identify what made them different, and communicate it clearly to the people now making direct purchasing decisions about their care. It didn't happen. The vocabulary of 1986 has just carried over into the marketing materials of today, unexamined, unchanged. Providers keep using charity sector language to describe themselves in a market they were now competing in. The shift from provider-directed to consumer-directed never reached the words organizations use to describe themselves. This means the language sitting on provider websites today is at minimum 39 years old. I have grey hair, I am running out of hair, and I am 38 years old. In 1986, these concepts were radical and were absolutely pioneering and a huge step forward for us. But it's 2026 now. It doesn't mean an awful lot. It's wallpaper. It's recited so consistently across the sector, it has stopped communicating anything. It is the definition of tautology. Now, it's tempting to treat this as a minor stylistic issue or to act like it's just not a big deal or maybe it's a little tweak and it can change a few things. It isn't. When every provider, website and social media uses the same words to make the same promises, the words stop functioning as information. Every provider describing themselves as high quality when we know that they are not as good as each other renders the whole concept of quality as completely ridiculous. And quality relative to what? A family searching for support for someone they love cannot use person-centered or compassionate care to distinguish one provider from another, because every single provider on the page in front of them is saying the exact same thing. This forces decision-making onto other factors entirely. Price, availability, location, and whoever responds the fastest. Word of mouth from someone who happened to have a good experience can go a long way. None of these are bad ways to choose a provider, sure, but they mean your actual point of difference, the thing your organization does better or differently than anyone else, never gets the chance to factor in their decision making. It is buried under the same bloody words every competitor is also using. There's a second cost that's a little harder to quantify, but just as real. Language this generic erodes over trust over time. People are not stupid. And in Australia, in the NDIS, they are becoming more sophisticated every day. When every website promises the same outcomes in the same words, readers start to discount the promises entirely. We are passionate about empowering our participants to achieve their goals, have been read so many times in so many contexts, it just doesn't mean anything anymore. The sincerity behind the words, which I'm sure is very genuine in most providers, is now getting lost. In the course of this research, a handful of phrases stood out as particularly revealing, either because they were unintentionally honest about how some providers think of their work, or because they demonstrated just how interchangeable the language across the sector has become. One organisation described itself with the phrase synergy of service provision. That is corporate jargon dropped directly into a sentence about caring for people, and it reveals how disconnected some of this language has become from the actual human work being described. Another used the phrase build a brighter, more independent future together, a sentence constructed almost entirely from words on this list: brighter, independent, future, together. But have a think about what that also implies. A brighter future. What are you saying about my parenting? What are you saying about my experience as a disabled person? It's not bright, says who? And who could have been generated? This could have been generated by stitching together other providers' homepages. It's exactly what has happened across the sector for years. Here in Australia in the NDIS, we often get talked about, because of the large amounts of funding involved, oh, it's a bloody scam. Everyone's just, there's cartels using it, organized crime, the rest of it. And sometimes it's hard to argue when you go to all these websites that are just poor design, poor quality, all copy and pasted from each other. They look like generic fronts, Um, a third described its participants as people the organization was giving hope to. Language that positions the provider as the source of hope, rather than a participant as someone who already has their own goals, plans, and reasons for living their life the way they choose to. Assuming that someone doesn't have hope because they're disabled is, in my mind, kind of discriminatory, a little bit dickish. This kind of framing, even if it's unintentional, and I do hope and assume the best, is that it just repositions the relationship in a way that contradicts choice and control principles our NDIS system was built on. And they're not isolated mistakes by careless or careless organizations. They're symptoms of an entire sector writing the same template without examining what it actually says. Off the shelf marketing and off the shelf language. So what do you do? The fix isn't like to invent entirely new language or to abandon English in favor of something more abstract. Often the fix can just be a bit more specific. Instead of person-centered care, describe what that actually looks like in your organization. What does it mean? Does it mean that the participants get to choose their own support worker from a short list? Does it mean the participant get to interview your support workers to determine which one they would like to work with? Does it mean that care plans are reviewed monthly with the participant rather than annually? And if so, say that. Instead of passionate and dedicated team, say how long the average support worker has been with you, or what your staff retention rate is compared to the sector average maybe. Specific variable numbers can do a lot more work than just a broad generic adjective. Instead of achieve your goals, tell a story of a participant that's done exactly that. Specificity is what every one of these phrases is missing. And specificity is the only thing a generic phrase can never offer. It's about becoming remarkable. And remarkable doesn't mean curing cancer or doing something incredible. Remarkable is about having something about you that people are going to remember or mention to somebody else. It doesn't mean abandoning the values behind the language. Independence, dignity, choice and control, hell yeah, they remain the right things for a disability service provider to stand for. But standing for them and just saying the same 6 words everyone else says are not the same thing. We need to build trust. And we have to stand for it through our actions and through being able to clearly articulate how we are doing this and why we are doing it. The Disability Services Act of 86 deserves a lot of credit for the shift it created. The language it introduced was, for its time, a genuine break from institutional and dehumanising ways of describing disability support and people. But 39 years is a long time for any sentence or any phrase to do the same job. The NDIS created the conditions for real competition and real differentiation. And the sector has spent the years since acting, writing, promoting, and advertising as though nothing has changed. If your organisation's website could be copied and pasted onto a competitor's domain without really anyone noticing, it's not just a writing problem, it's a strategy problem. And it's worth fixing before the next family or the next coordinator searching for support reads your homepage and cannot tell you apart from anyone else on the page. Anyway, that's enough ranting from me. I hope you found this episode insightful, useful. Please share, like, comment, subscribe, all those good things to help boost this episode and this podcast and the algorithm. I really do appreciate your support, and I'll catch you next week. Look after yourself. Take care.